Everyone, welcome to Fire Essential. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Craig Meyer, and I'm the coordinator of the Tallgrass Prairie and Oak Savanna Fire Science Exchange. I'm going to be your moderator today. Fire is Essential is a collaboration between the Tallgrass Prairie and Oak Savanna Fire Science Consortium and the Great Plains Fire Science Exchange and our panelists today. So both the Great Plains Fire Science Exchange and the Tallgrass Prairie and Oak Savanna Fire Science Consortium are part of the Joint Fire Science Program's Fire Science Exchange Network. And our mission is to support the use of science to make good decisions about fire management. There are 15 regional members of this network. And as you can see from the map here, the two consortia or exchanges that are bringing this to you today cover most of the mid-continent grasslands. Next, I'd like to take a minute to introduce Lori Bamerlin from the Great Plains.
Hi, everybody. I'm Lori. I'm the outreach coordinator for the Great Plains Fire Science Exchange. And we also have the coordinator and PI, Carol Baldwin, is also joining us today.
All right. Thanks, Lori. Before I introduce today's panelists, just wanted to go over some guidelines to help us have a good discussion today. First one is with the group this size, to please keep your video and microphone muted. That will just reduce interruptions and potential distractions during the discussion. Number two then is ask you to please share questions that you have in the chat box. We do have time on the agenda to bring these into the discussion. And we definitely want to share questions from the chat that aren't otherwise coming up in the discussion. The last thing before we meet our panelists is that I wanted to mention we will be posting a link to the evaluation survey in the chat, and you'll also get that in a follow-up email. This questionnaire is pretty short, just 5 or 6 questions. It'll give you a chance to share feedback on the relevance and usefulness of the discussion for your work. It'll also have some questions in there to help suggest future topics for this, because this is a series that we'd like to see continue between these two exchanges and possibly others to bring in grassland fire science questions from across the US. So with those items covered, I will go ahead and introduce our panelists. So first up, we have Amy Simstead from the USGS.
Hello, everyone. So I am a research ecologist with the Northern Prairie Wildlife Research Center, which is in Jamestown, North Dakota, but I am stationed at Wind Cave National Park, which is shown by the red star in this map on the left, in southwestern South Dakota, because my primary duties is working with National Park Service units in what I'll call the Northwestern Great Plains, and those Park Service units are shown by the black dots in the map. The area that I work with is primarily northern mixed grass prairie, indicated by the gray in this map here, and getting a little bit into the short grass prairie in western Nebraska and eastern Wyoming. And a couple of the pictures on the right here show that this is relatively short statured grassland compared to, say, the eastern tallgrass prairie. My research focuses on basically those grasslands and management of those grasslands. Much of that management in this area is focused not as much on woody encroachment as it is on reducing invasive grasses, particularly the annual brome grasses, and to some degree, invasive cool season perennial grasses like smooth brome and Kentucky bluegrass. I do that type of work through field scale experiments, working with the Park Service's data that they have collected through vegetation monitoring, incorporating that into models that can be used in formal adaptive management programs. I've also been involved quite a bit in both conceptual and quantitative climate change scenario planning. And when those discussions those discussions almost always involve how climate change might affect not only the say frequency of wildfires and intensity, but also the ability to conduct prescribed fires in a changing climate. And even though a lot of my pictures here show models, I also do like to get out and do some of my own field work. And that's enough for me.
All right, thank you so much, Amy. Great to get some views of the northern mixed grass prairie here before we get going. I'm just going to work my way from west to east. So next up, we have Dave Blondie, who's with Oklahoma State University.
Let me get a few slides up here. Oh, yeah, I can't share my screen, but I can go ahead with my introduction. So I'm Dave Blondie. As has been said, I'm a postdoc researcher at Oklahoma State University. And I'm kind of coming to this, oh, here are my slides. To this talk with kind of more of a wildlife background. So I've kind of been working in the Great Plains for the better part of the last 10 years. Started off in North Dakota and kind of been working my way south into the southern Great Plains. And much of my work, especially more recently, has kind of touched on, kind of the entire region. But most of my experience that's going to be kind of relevant to today's discussion is kind of come from these two areas in Oklahoma, specifically the Flint Hills, where I did much of my master's in PhD work, really kind of looking at how grassland birds and grassland birds communities respond to fire and grazing management. And then also I've spent a fair amount of time working in Western Oklahoma, which is more mixed grass prairies, kind of co-dominated with shrubs. Again, kind of looking at not just how fire influences these species, but how the absence of fire is starting to impact different bird communities. Specifically, how woody plant encroachment that's starting to occur is kind of starting to push out a lot of these more grassland bird communities. And so a lot of my focus is really kind of been more on game birds. So the greater prairie chicken, which is what I did most of my PhD and master's work in, out in the tallgrass prairies of Oklahoma, and then more Rio Grande wild turkeys in Western Oklahoma. But I've also done quite a bit of work on other, passerine birds as well. And kind of as I mentioned, the main thrust of most of my research has been how do we manage grasslands with fire and grazing to provide habitat for a diversity of wildlife species. Most of my focus has been on grassland bird communities, but it's much more than that. And kind of the species that I picked bird species that I picked to put on my screen, kind of represents the challenge of how do you manage grasslands for a diverse wildlife community, because you have some species like the western meadowlark, which may require relatively short time since fires for their habitat requirement, whereas species like the Henslow sparrow or the Bell's vireo, which need much longer time since fire. And then species like the greater prairie chicken or the wild turkey, which need basically all sorts of different fire maintained habitats as well. And so being able to make informed decisions about how and when to burn what species you're benefiting and what species, choosing to burn at certain times might, how that might either positively or negatively impact different species within the community and what those trade-offs are. And then more and more recently, my research has kind of been focusing a little bit on understanding woody plant encroachment well, and how the decision not to burn is starting to affect a lot of these grassland bird communities. And so with that, I'm kind of excited to share some of my thoughts and experience working with fire management and wildlife here in the Southern Great Plains. And thank you.
All right. Thanks so much, David. Excited to have you on to help share more about the wildlife aspects of what we'll be talking about. Let's see. Next up, going west to east, we have Doug Spencer, who is with the Natural Resources Conservation Service in Kansas.
Is that screen coming through okay? All right. So yeah, it's Doug Spencer. I serve as the state grazing specialist with the Natural Resources Conservation Service in Kansas. And really just kind of from that standpoint, I serve as a technical lead. And so our agency provides a lot of technical services or technical planning assistance to producers in our state. And so I serve as that kind of across the whole. So we have, tallgrass prairie in the east, clear to shortgrass prairie in the west. But where kind of fire fits in its planning process is, what are those resource concerns, those issues that our landowners, producers are facing, and where does these practice and or practices, and that might be fire, grazing, the interactions of those. And so that really kind of guides, where and how we implement or maybe suggest using fire. But it is ultimately it's the client's decisions to use or not use, and kind of how and when. I did want to point out just in the lower right hand side of the screen there is we do have some iconic grasslands, I'll call that, but we have our Flint Hills in the eastern third part of the state, that tallgrass prairie. Wanted to point out also the Gypsum Hills and Smoky Hills, but that kind of lighter tan areas, that's our rangelands, around about 15.5 million acres of native grasslands. Kind of the yellow in the east is more kind of our introduced or maybe fescue, bromes, those kind of grasslands that might be more introduced species. But from a picture standpoint and just the awesome landscape that I do get to traverse or look at is just wanted to point out a couple of those. One being the Flint Hills, and really kind of some contrasting photos. All these photos in the upper portion are in the Flint Hills, but on the left-hand side is where fire is utilized consistently with purpose, and versus some of those areas that maybe fire frequency, intensity on the right-hand side. Same thing in the Gyp Hills or Red Hills. And so woody encroachment is definitely a significant concern, especially in the eastern, but honestly across our state. And so that's definitely what our producers have concerns with, and what we do a lot of planning with or trying to combat those particular species. Interesting within our state, especially in Flint Hills, there's a huge fire culture. And so there's roughly, about 2.1 million acres gets burned annually within that landscape. And so there's definitely a culture of fire in our Red Hills, Gyp Hills areas. There's culture building, and a lot of it through a prescribed burn association and across our state. And then finally, I just wanted to kind of point out is just from a training or what I get to do is on the left-hand side, I come at this with two hats a little bit today. On the left-hand side, I serve as a state grazing specialist, and we have chances to actually use live fire, train our employees, why we're using that, how they can go about that. And so the upper portion, we burn small grass plots at our plant materials center to provide training, but also get experts like John Weir from Oklahoma State into the state to provide training to our employees where we can use live fire, how that interacts. And I also live and own land, and so in our state. And so those photos kind of on the right are different experiences I've gotten to have in using fire on the landscape. And so as a neighbor role, as either fire bossing those on my own land or helping neighbors, but that's kind of the experience I come with today, and really appreciate the opportunity. So.
Yeah, we appreciate having you here, Doug, and looking forward to learning more about your work with technical advisor and for those views from all across Kansas. Okay, next up, I'd like to introduce Matt Garrett from Johnson County, Kansas.
Thanks for having me, Craig. So yeah, I'm from Northeast Kansas, and I am a natural resource manager. I am an active land manager. Two of my teams are currently burning prairies while we're on this Zoom call, so I'm bummed to be missing out, but I'm excited for what we're talking about today. So I work for the only special park district in the state of Kansas, and we are a suburb of Kansas City. And my team has an aggressive fire management program in a community of 600,000 plus residents. Our parks see over like 7 million visitors a year. So we're at kind of national park visitation levels, but we continue to consistently use fire in this urban environment. And our county was 86% prairie in the 1850s. And of those remnant populations, those old growth prairies, we have less than a 0.1% of that left. And I'm incredibly passionate about protecting those small isolated remnants and building those back and creating new like patchworks of habitat restoration around them. So we protect those small sites, and we're aggressively beginning to do large, to us, landscape level restoration. We have Big Bull Creek Park that I'm currently working on 1,000-acre prairie restoration that spans across I-35, and working in this urban interface with fire. When I started this 1,000-acre restoration, it was a rural area, and now it's being surrounded by Amazon warehouses. So the work that we're doing is changing day by day and year by year. And while we are in an urban suburban environment, one of my sites had more Mead's milkweed stems than the entire state of Missouri a few years ago on just one unit that we manage with fire. And so some of these isolated locations are incredibly important with diversity. So my team's doing a lot of good work on the ground. We have a Christmas tree cedar harvest every year, and we had to cancel it because we ran out of cedar trees on our prairies for folks to cut down. So we're seeing some progress in this urban area. And separately, I do manage a large native seed collection program where volunteers work with us in a seed barn, and post-fire, we aggressively plant, overseed, and put plugs in the ground to grow out more of our conservative forbs. So I'm here as a land manager with some real kind of on the ground urban experience.
Thanks, Matt. I appreciate that introduction. And you touched on a lot of things that came up in questions that people submitted as they registered as well about, working with volunteers. And it's going to be great, I think, to have your wildland urban interface perspective here as well, and the levels of visitation. So thanks for that. Let's see, and our final speaker final panelist to introduce today is Pauline Drobny, formerly of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.
Yes, so I was just reflecting. I love the idea of having the cedars as Christmas trees and running out of them. That's great. I have had worked for about, excuse me, I've worked for about 40 years plus on ecological restoration, starting at in the 70s, when the field of ecological restoration really was in its infancy and the term wasn't invented yet, and worked at the University of Northern Iowa in a biological preserve system, leading a team of people who were attempting to do prairie reconstruction, and we managed state preserves and some other things. So then I ended up from there launching a career with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that has spanned 30 years and 3 different positions. The first one as the first biologist at Neal Smith National Wildlife Refuge, which was a precedent in ecological restoration with about 800 acres of remnant prairie and savanna there, mostly pretty beat up. In addition to thousands of acres of agricultural land that was to be converted to, as near as we could figure out how to do it, emulating what was there historically. And so this was a big challenge. That refuge is now around 11,000 acres. From that, very challenging and exciting time, because we were really inventing an awful lot of techniques and working with volunteers, working with, people who were seed producers, trying to get enough seed of local ecotype origin to be able to fill the need, and then figuring out how to do burning that would suit the needs of this particular effort. And after about 10 years, I ended up being land management and research demonstration biologist for Region 3, the Midwest region of U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, about 8 states. It is 8 states. And so in that role, I did direct a research program. There was a lot of pragmatic on-the-ground learning with that, and a lot of networking within the Fish and Wildlife Service and outside the Fish and Wildlife Service. So there was a lot of partnering going on. My last decade has been, again, with the Fish and Wildlife Service, but in the inventory and monitoring division. And in this, I worked with a lot of stations within our region, and so bounded by Minnesota, Missouri, Ohio, and along the western edge along the Missouri River, but worked beyond that boundary to the west and to the east. So with other not only Fish and Wildlife Service stations. So getting into mixed grass prairie, we are in our region in the heart of the Tallgrass Prairie area. And so most of this is where the rich soils were produced. And so most of it has succumbed to agriculture. And so it is particularly where I live, most of my work is, my office has been in Iowa, though I've worked beyond Iowa in a lot of my work. It is arguably the most decimated state in the union. And so there's been a lot of concern about finding ways to rebuild prairie from scratch, in addition to really caring for those remnants that are still here, not only in Iowa, but in this Midwest region. And so it's volunteerism has been a lot of featured prevalently in my career as well. And fire is something that is as necessary as sunshine and rain to these beleaguered ecosystems, either regardless of whether they're remnant, some people call them native prairies or grasslands, or if they are reconstructed or started from scratch. And so I tend to take the approach a little bit more holistically than some people, focusing on the system, including the soils, the microbiota, fire, the plants and the mammals, invertebrates. So trying to take a holistic approach to all of this, recognizing that under certain circumstances, we do need to address specific needs of a species that may be about to wink out. So I guess this is I'll leave it there. And it's been an avocation and a vocation and a passion of mine to see what we can do creatively, to try to come together. And I firmly believe, well, I'm going to save some of this for when we get into our discussion, but I do want to say that part of my work has also been to provide some leadership in developing protocols for prairie management, the Prairie Reconstruction Initiative, which is reconstructed prairies, and also the Savanna monitoring program, which is remnant savannas, another grassland system.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Pauline. It's great to have you here with your experience, and I think too the contrast between the prairie reconstructions in Iowa and some of the remnant or native grasslands is going to be an interesting discussion as well. So really appreciate having you here. I'm going to go ahead and spotlight our speakers, and then we can jump into the first questions that we had. And hopefully this will just make it a little bit less distracting for everyone with all those panels everybody else who's out there. Okay. So one of the things that we talked about when we were setting up this first discussion for fire across the grasslands is that we are hearing a lot about the reasons to use fire for restoration, woody encroachment, trees in the southern grasslands, trees coming in the savannas and tallgrass prairie from the east. We know that's a real problem. And in addition to combating or controlling the negative, we thought it'd be good to start this out to hear a little bit more about what you're using fire for. If you could talk about the benefits that you're seeing to fire in your particular systems, what's keeping you going, because it is, of course, can be really resource intensive with everything that we're bringing to this. So we'd like to hear about the positive attributes that you're seeing from fire management. And I can pick on someone, or you can feel free to jump in.
Greg, could I share another slide? As
Yeah,
part of this?
Yep, you still have that ability.
Okay. I think this one's kind of a visual, might help on some of it. So get the right one here. Is that coming through okay?
Yes.
Great. This is one of the things and why I think just some of this is sort of new data, but if we're using things like the rangeland analysis platform that's able to look at cover across landscapes and how those things have changed. And so this picture here kind of depicts what woody transitions have occurred from 1990 to 2020. And what's interesting is there's also been some great data or tracking of where fire is used, consistently or more frequently. And you can really see the overline from the standpoint is, one of our core areas, but the red is there's more fire frequency in the landscape. And if you look over here, that would be that same county right here. And so if you kind of trace that out, but on landscape views or landscape scales, I think that really points out as to, again, that woody encroachment is a serious concern for us. And we realize that fire is a big component of making sure those grasslands stay grasslands. So that's definitely one of those. We see that within that and more at local scales, then our clients really like to utilize that not only to combat invasive species, but to try to improve livestock distribution across the landscape, to try to improve forage quality with that fire on the landscape. And of course, in combination with that is kind of wildlife habitat, is trying to keep either a moving or a mosaic across the landscape. So we do have some producers using a patch burn grazing system or pyrrhic herbivory kind of systems, smaller scales on those, but definitely those are probably those main reasons why our producers utilize that on our landscape.
Thanks, Doug. Those core areas that you showed there in the Flint Hills really do jump out from 1990 to 2020. Can you remind us again on a ballpark of what private landowners are burning on average per year there?
On acreage wise? Yeah, somewhere in that, it's 2 to 2.5 million. It kind of fluctuates up and down. We've got some great tracking mechanisms. Actually, KDHE tracks those annually to see, the droughts of 2012, 13 timeframe. Well, really 11, 12, kind of 13 timeframe. We had much less acreage, so the drought did impact the level and extents of that. But yeah, those are the kind of core areas. What's interesting is a lot of people think that's the whole thing's annually burnt, but you can see there that there's quite a bit that honestly, we're probably at a fire deficit in some of those areas based on where woody encroachment's getting a little bit of a foothold. So great data to be able to have though.
Yeah, that's interesting to hear even a fire deficit there, possibly in places in the Flint Hills where there is so much burning.
I'll just go ahead and jump in after Doug, since we have this shared experience working in the Flint Hills. So as Doug kind of mentioned, a lot of, the fire within the Flint Hills really is production driven. And so we're actually, in kind of a unique situation in the Flint Hills where in most places when it comes to, managing wildlife and fire, there maybe isn't enough fire, but in the Flint Hills, it's actually kind of over the last 30 years been sort of the reverse situation where there's almost too much fire too frequently. for a lot of species. So the greater prairie chicken's been a great example of that, where, you know, there's a lot, you know, annual burning was reducing, you know, nesting habitat for the species, which resulted in some pretty significant declines of the greater prairie chicken. And so, but more recently, probably over the last maybe 10 to 10 years, there's been a lot more interest in how to implement more wildlife friendly burning practices within the Flint Hills. It still hasn't spread very far, but it's definitely taken a foothold, and that's where, you know, Doug mentioned kind of more patch burn grazing, heterogeneity based management. And so, you know, in the Flint Hills, it's kind of this really interesting dynamic of, you know, the historic cultural practices where there's almost too much fire for some grassland bird species. But as Doug just pointed out, you know, we're starting to get some of this woody plant encroachment. We actually, I was an author on a paper that just came out at OSU, kind of showing, you know, it's very similar data to what Doug just showed, that right on the edges of the Flint Hill, there is, you know, kind of, you know, woody plants starting to creep into the Flint Hills. So trying to, you know, really encourage that landowners to kind of find that balance if they're interested in managing for wildlife, for kind of, you know, providing, you know, more, continuing that fire practice, but maybe spreading it out a little more, leaving areas in, you know, unburned for a few years to provide that habitat for prairie chickens or hens sparrows, but still burning often enough to really kind of keep that woody plant encroachment in bay. And that's been an incredibly difficult challenge for us of kind of how to, you know, target that messaging with landowners who are interested in managing for wildlife, specifically in the Flint Hills, of trying to get that balance right.
Well, thanks for jumping in with that, Dave. I think we'll probably have some more questions at the end about that as well, because that is a theme that came up with folks who registered about those trade-offs and, you know, burning at the right frequency and scale for wildlife species. So it's awesome to hear that coming up already.
I think there's a few other things that come into fire and besides frequency and scale, and part of that is timing. And in the Tallgrass Prairie area where I work and have spent time on my own land trying to do ecological restoration, which has advantages and disadvantages in that didn't have all the big equipment and burn crews that were all trained up the way they are in the Fish and Wildlife Service. And so then doing it as a private landowner, which is a different sort of beast with volunteers and you know, our backpack pumps and flappers and all of that. And but one of the things that I feel that we probably underestimate the need for, at least in the area I work, for annual fires. It's probably very difficult for most people to be able to do a fire annually in an area. And when I say an annual fire, I'm not saying everything should burn black to the ground, you know, but I think that there are ways to have that not happen. One time I was at Neil Smith Refuge. I was not the biologist there anymore, but there had been a burn done, and the person who was leading the fire, the prescribed fire specialist, had just decided he was going to do it on a kind of a moist day. I kind of thought it was a mistake. I really went out there to look around and see what had happened. It was in the fall. I'm a proponent of fall burns, by the way, but I think that I thought that this one was a failure. And I went out there and walked around, and this was in across a fairly large, I don't know, 800 acres, maybe. It's between 400 and 800 acres. Probably more like 500 acres. This area that had been burned under kind of misty conditions, or at least more moist conditions, even in tall grasses that were way over my head, there were places through that just did not burn. And it was not just necessarily limited to those areas of different planting areas. They went across planting areas and through remnants. The fires went through. I noticed that there was differences in burn intensity within areas. So in some areas there were stocky things remained, but the grasses burned down. So things like round-headed bush clover remained, the stalks remained. So, you know, those apartment buildings for invertebrates, for those kind of stocky plants may have persisted. There were areas where it just skimmed the top of the grasses. There were places where it went through tall grass, burned it down to the ground, and yet right next to it, tall grasses remained, and it wasn't where the drip torch had gone. You know, it wasn't because that created that effect. So what I'm trying to say is that if we had the ability to burn for ecological reasons, then we could perhaps, and we had the resources, the crews to do the burning, we might be able to accomplish more of our objectives at once. You know, with wildlife, there's a lot of wildlife. There's a lot of Henslow sparrows, for example, at Neil Smith Refuge. Right now, there's not as much fire on the land because of a change in policy and how fires are implemented. But it even when there was a fair amount of fire on there, we had a lot of Henslows there. And so it's that kind of that patchiness within a burned area, I think, is a pretty important thing.
Yeah, well, one thing I'll just note there too, we did have some questions about how folks determine success, and I think you touched on a few things there, but maybe that's something we can come back to toward the end as well. But also want to make sure that we hear from Matt and Amy too about their goals for, you know, what fire is promoting in the prairie.
I'll jump in as a little bit of a contrast to a lot of the discussions, particularly with respect to woody encroachment. As I mentioned in my introduction, I work primarily with National Park Service units. So the prescribed fire program, in all of their fire management plans, fire is mentioned basically as a critical ecosystem process. It's part of the natural landscape. So just in of itself, it is considered, you know, it is done for that ecological process reason. However, when it comes to actually getting funding to do prescribed fires, you almost always have to put something in there about the wildland urban interface, be that with the visitor center of the park or fuels reduction. So there's this mismatch between what the Park Service really wants to do, or what the role of fire in these grassland parks really is, and how fire is funded in the agency itself. I also mentioned that, and as part of that, and also just depending on who's in charge of a certain area, probably most of the parks that I work with are in that fire deficit, as one of the other panelists mentioned, that the frequency is definitely not up at the rate that would have been occurring naturally. And there is certainly a suggestion that lower fire frequency is one of the reasons that some of these invasive grasses, particularly the perennial ones like Kentucky bluegrass, are more common on the landscape than they used to be, and perhaps also in the when it comes to the annual grasses, though that's up there hasn't been enough research on that to really understand those grasses as much. And some of the work that we're doing right now, using data from the fire ecology program of the Park Service that has been collected over the last 20 years, is suggesting that prescribed fire is good at reducing those invasive grasses, both the annual and the perennial, once they have gotten into a system, but there may be some risk of a prescribed fire in an area that is not currently invaded, opening up the opportunity for invasion by some of these species. And this is fairly new, so we haven't looked into the mechanisms, but I assume it's in some places that perhaps burned hotter. There's some areas that basically are where there was mortality of the native perennial grasses that opens it up for others to come in. So kind of like with the wildlife aspect, there's still a lot to learn in terms of where you get the most benefit and least problems that occur from doing fire at different times and at different frequencies.
And
I
it
guess-
also,
Oh,
excuse
go
me.
ahead, Pauline.
Amy, I just wanted to bounce off you for a minute here, and that is that I think that that's a good point. And one of the things that it also begs the question of, do we have enough cool season native species in our prairies, which I think have gotten hit hard for the ways that with grazing and with a number of other kinds of things. the cool season species in prairies and savannas are at risk, but there has also been research that has shown that with a good sward of cool season native grasses, that it resists invasive species. So I think that's one thing to think about.
Yeah, and that balance between cool season and warm season really shifts as you move from west to east, where, a lot of the prairies I'm working in, it's almost, or the cool seasons are the dominant species. But they're still getting invaded by other cool season grasses. So it's probably different between the mixed northern mixed and the tall grass. One other thing that I wanted to point out that is a little different between this northwestern part of the Great Plains and most of our other panelists is that there is not much of a fire culture at all in this area. It's often viewed as detrimental to productivity in terms of rangeland forage availability, especially for domestic livestock. Although there's a lot of remnant native prairie around here, most of it is in livestock grazing. And if you, the view is that fire basically burns off your standing vegetation that is actually nutritious and useful to those domestic animals and wildlife. In contrast to the warm season tallgrass dominated areas where the dormant senesced plants are not all that nutritious to livestock. So it's seen as beneficial to get to burn it off. That's not the case as much in the cool season, or at least western wheatgrass dominated areas where I work.
Rolling back to some of the woody species discussion we had earlier, as a land manager, it's been interesting to see how we used to feel 10, 15 years ago that, you'd put fire on a landscape every 3 years or on a 3-year cycle, something like that, that the state of Kansas used to push out. And now we're realizing that our fire program we got to touch a landscape a lot more frequently now, and figuring out the staffing to get fire down. And then at the right time of the year, I personally, dormant season fire is my jam. A lot of the restorations we work in are high productivity, high biomass, nitrogen loving species. And when we've learned that when we put a high intensity fire on some of those in late spring, we don't get the long-term results out of some of these sites that we'd like to see versus our old growth remnant, really stable prairies. And so it's been interesting as a land manager. I've begun to back off of my spring fire have been moving to dormant fall and even late summer fire, depending on the units we're working in. And so we've kind of been responding to the woody growth and the amount of time we're having to put into some of these projects. And it's really shifting some of the work we do and the things we think about as we're trying to get the fire on the ground.
Thanks for that perspective on both the timing and how that differs between your reconstructions and the remnant or native prairies. That's one thing I wanted to make sure everyone shared as well, because I think we probably see some big differences across the geographic scope we have here, much less grasslands across the entire US. But can you talk a little bit more about like the percentage of reconstructed or planted prairie versus remnant or native prairie in your area, so we can get a sense for that as well.
I'll start off again. I guess from my standpoint in our state is, of course, we've got some of those native grasslands, I'll call those. Also during homesteading things, we also have areas that were farmed for a short period of time, and sometimes we'll call those either let go back, reseeded naturally, or actually seeded themselves. A big one from a seeded environment would be like our conservation reserve program that the Farm Service Agency kind of administers, but we've got a lot of sort of reconstructed, although sometimes minimal species. But those are probably the portions. I think we have around like 1.8 million or so acres of CRP in the state. And so that would be a lot of those. Some of that's wetland and other things, but would have some native species, within those. And like I mentioned earlier, around 15.5 million acres of sort of the native rangeland areas. So that's kind of just some of so we work with a lot of it, and sometimes it's within the same land unit actually. So depending on sort of some of that past impact.
With the producers then, are they looking at differences between the go back or CRP planted prairies versus the remnant or native in terms of how they're managing it?
They do. A lot of it, I think, still probably, I think it's more based on sort of that localized, so I can't make broad statements because, again, what is the thread is if they have a lot of woody pressure, whether it's, native sod or this go back, something like that, they're going to utilize that fire to really, impact that landscape. Some of our seeded areas would be ungrazed areas. So fire would be incorporated with those because we get so much biomass in the way that, with wildlife can't move through it or utilize it appropriately. And so we want to, utilize that on some of our reconstructed ones or seeded ones to just reduce some of that biomass buildup to get more benefits or services from that landscape. So those would be kind of some of the main reasons why. But really, when it comes down to fire is important in grasslands. So I think it comes down to a localized scale as to why, how, and that kind of stuff.
I think it's hard to quantify that ratio of native remnant prairie versus reconstructed or planted prairie. Certainly it is for me in the kind of the states that I've been working with. There's some pretty good prairies that end up being fairly large. Most of what we have is crop fields or grazed lands. But so and you get the Farm Bill program plantings, but then there's also people, the whole push towards pollinators and the importance of monarch butterfly, some of the publicity that surrounded that has captured the interest of people who are not necessarily within the same realm as many of us are as professional land managers or researchers, but people who are doing it kind of just on their own in the backyards or out in the farm in the grassy area. So I guess I can't really say what proportion there is, but both are represented.
It's kind of a tangent, but doing deep bee research, bee surveys of some of our remnant prairies has really opened my eyes as a land manager in the pollinator world, that a blue sage bee, is localized specifically to one of our remnant sites, and there's no salvia within miles. And making sure that when we're putting fire in the landscape with a lot of these incredibly kind of nichey native bees, that the work we're doing is not, as you spoke of earlier, making sure that success isn't a hellscape of burned blackened earth, that we're leaving enough stems up for a lot of these species. And we learned a lot that an annually hayed prairie was missing a huge group of bees just due to that management regime. And a lot of the things that we do on a landscape can really definitely guide what wildlife is present. So that's been eye-opening to me, is to really look at some of those other pollinator indicators that are out there on how we should be managing.
And at Neil Smith Refuge, when they were burning quite frequently, well, they didn't burn the whole refuge, but doing bee surveys, they were finding that they were getting these very conservative prairie species, even within those burned areas. So it's really interesting to think about, what do we know and what do we not know, and where are these bees coming from, outside just even where did they come from in the first place on a refuge that was mostly agriculture, So there's a lot of questions I think that we have about pollinators and about invertebrates in general. And one of the things that has been very interesting to me is Laura Rarica, who is an entomologist and does a lot of work with invertebrates in general, and is out there in the field in those times. She knows that certain invertebrates will only be there at a particular time of day when the sun is at a particular angle and the humidity is, if you don't look at those specific times, you don't see them, she says. And her recommendation, when she has been out she's from Illinois, and when she has been out looking for invertebrates, she says that those prairies that are burned annually are the ones that have the highest diversity of conservative species. And she says, that's because you don't have that buildup of dust. She said the second best, recognizing that not all managers can do this, burn annually, or is every other year. But once you get into 3 years and beyond, you are going to be losing invertebrates, because there is so much buildup of a heavy fuel loading in our area where there's moisture and tallgrass prairie. And so it's something that was very eye-opening to me in learning about invertebrates and what they need. They may actually need something different than what we have assumed.
Yeah, and I'll kind of jump in. At least where I'm at in the Flint Hills, I'm primarily working with, historically unplowed tallgrass prairie, but kind of with some of my stuff further west in Oklahoma, it's a lot more mixed with both kind of remnant prairie that's largely been sort of maintained for production, a lot of agriculture, be it wheat, kind of more cotton like Texas, but also a lot of CRP land, which, kind of having that juxtaposition of, remnant prairie, agriculture, CRP, really kind of makes these really dynamic landscapes as far as wildlife go. And so kind of, I think as Pauline mentioned, the importance of heterogeneity for a lot of these species. And so that's been kind of a big challenge in terms of, just research and management, figuring out how, these different species use these really dynamic landscapes in the West, and also, how to better manage some of these areas as well. So specifically like stuff like CRP may be really important resources for some, as an example, like the lesser prairie chicken during certain times of the year where, say there may not be as much, nesting cover on, protection oriented lands, or no nesting cover in like agriculture. but outside of those periods, these CRP lands don't provide hardly any cover or resources. To figuring out how to kind of balance the management of these different types of grasslands, be it CRP versus native range, to provide the sufficient habitat for all these species in these really kind of complex, heterogeneous, at really core scale landscapes.
I think we're hearing a lot about that heterogeneity at different scales. That's interesting, kind of how it plays out differently across the region. Amy, do you have anything to add about the reconstructed versus native grasslands in your part of the region?
As I mentioned, there is this part of the country has a much larger proportion of its landscape in probably unplowed prairie, though some work that Pete Bauman of South Dakota State University has done, trying to really understand how much is unplowed versus fairly old go back land, as Doug mentioned, is actually smaller than I expected. That I think there was a lot of area that was plowed fairly early in the last century that was people realized this is not a place to be trying to grow crops, and because there weren't as many invasive species, then it went back to native composition fairly well. And along with that, this not being a place to grow row crops, at least until fairly recently, when genetic engineering has made them more drought tolerant, et cetera. There have not been very many reconstructions, prairie reconstructions, because it's unlike where you guys get rain. If you plant some seeds, there's a 1 in 3 chance that you're going to have a drought, in the next year, and you're not going to get anything to grow. So there, and as a consequence, there hasn't been the industry of seed sources, commercial, that have built up in the Tallgrass region. So there aren't a lot of reconstructions either in the parks where I work or on the landscape as a whole. However, there's a fair amount of land that has been planted into non-native grass species that were developed to be able to grow in these more arid areas. So, and that's been a source of some of the problems in our native prairies, of course, the smooth brome, to some degree, crested wheatgrass, and other improved species being planted in areas and now encroaching into those native remnant grasslands.
Right. Thanks, Amy. I think this is really highlighting some of the differences, even with the similarities among grasslands, some the local nuances you move across this pretty broad part of the country. So we do have about 25 minutes left in the discussion, so I did just want to check in for folks. We haven't seen a lot of questions in the chat, but one of the themes that people were sharing in some of the questions were about promoting the use of fire, increasing resources for prescribed burning, that sort of thing. And that did tie into one of the themes that we talked about as we were preparing for the panel today. So I thought I'd shift in that direction and see where our discussion goes, and see what kind of questions might come in from the chat. But one of the things that we wanted to ask about there is, so in your part of the country, how does fire affect the people who are living on or using the grasslands? And then, how how are people affecting ability to use fire from what you're seeing, either inhibiting use of fire or supporting it, as we've been hearing about that as well. So we'll just let whoever wants to jump on that one first go.
I'll mention that in this region where fire is less popular among private landowners, there is often great hostility towards the federal agencies doing their prescribed fires. And of course, those are in the rare occasion where there's an escape fire, congressional representatives will step in and make it difficult for those agencies to continue with their prescribed fire program. I think the whole thing that happened in New Mexico this past winter is having widespread ramifications and could affect the ability for agencies to be doing prescribed fires in the longer term. So it goes from all the way from that local level and of, the neighbor complaining about the smoke, supposedly giving his cattle pneumonia, to that neighbor then complaining to the senator, and that senator almost, shutting things down for a year or two. That's a reality that a lot of that has affected things in this region.
Yeah,
And the-
a burn boss was arrested on a prescribed fire in Oregon this fall, which put, chills down the spines of a lot of practitioners to see somebody at handcuffs on a prescribed fire. So that definitely caught the attention of folks, like you said, Amy.
In the Tallgrass area where I live, it seems to me that in these states, there seems to be in some ways a fire friendliness among farmers and I guess rural people. The farmers will they'll go out and burn their roadsides, or they'll burn certain areas to clean them up. And so fire is somewhat accepted. As you get closer to urban areas, then that get into really the smoke. You get the smoke management and the wildland urban interface issues, and so then that kind of tamps it down. My concern is that a culture of fire suppression could happen, particularly with the discussions surrounding climate change and trying to reduce carbon released into the air, and people not understanding how that one fire in a prairie increases a tremendous amount of carbon underground, the root growth and root degradation in short and longer periods of time. That's banked long term, but I think that discussion isn't out there enough. But in terms of agencies and that are funded by wildfire monies, that's somebody mentioned either, there's not a lot of wildfires that are in a good portion of the Midwest region of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. There are some, but those places that don't have wildfires don't get funding, for fires, and so they end up being, fire goes to other places, and the system in that way is broken, and that there should be base support for fire in terms of funding. It should be just a basic management funding line, and it should be supported. And I think that a lot of the management that we have to do, not all of it, some of it is very specific in terms of, even if we look at invasive species, many of the species that we battle with, smooth brome, sweet clover, Kentucky bluegrass, a lot of them actually do succumb to well-timed fires. And you may switch that strategy to something else when your prairie or your savanna is in better shape. But so I think it would make sense in terms of management to look at it as a base management funding need, but we have a hard time with that because of the source of our funding.
And I guess I'll just kind of say, particularly where I work, it's a lot of with a lot of private landowners. And so kind of, especially more so to the west, there's a lot of kind of either reluctance around fire, fear around fire, because many of these landowners are very, production oriented. They want to maintain that grass and that cover for their cattle, and they're worried, you burn, or if you burn too much, you could lose, all their forage for a year. And so that kind of, sort of those sorts of concerns definitely come into play in terms of, whether or not people are willing to implement fire. There's also, a lot of safety concerns just in terms from private landowners, as far as, they don't want to be the one to, have a fire escape and, get sued by their neighbors. And so, the combination of, concerns about how fire will affect, their remaining grassland and safety issues are certainly kind of, pretty important factors in terms of landowners. But it certainly is, things like woody plant encroachment are starting to become, a bigger and bigger issue. There is a lot more interest in, how do we use fire to kind of maintain these landscapes. So that's kind of helping to break down some of those barriers and concerns with landowners, because they're kind of recognizing, well, if I don't burn, I might not have grasslands down the road. And then kind of as a kind of a tangential point, culture plays a lot into, even if we have people who are willing to use fire, it plays a lot into how they use a fire. So one thing that we've kind of been working on a lot more is trying to start discussions about burning during different seasons, kind of more summer burns or fall burns, and that can have a whole range of benefits for managers, from providing wildlife habitat. There's some safety benefits that some of the managers that we've worked with, there's some smoke management issues. But kind of some of the main barriers that we've kind of come up against with kind of trying to start these discussions about burning during different types of years for wildlife objectives does kind of seem to stem a lot from just cultural practices, especially in like the Flint Hills. It's March 1st you burn. And so when we start talking to people about, well, do we want to, consider maybe a September burn for some of these wildlife objectives, there's a lot of hesitancy at first. But at least for the managers that we've worked with, that have tried it, that once they do try it, there is, that kind of, they start to see the benefits, and that helps break down the barriers. But certainly culture plays a big part with this, particularly among, private landowners.
Yeah, the rise of the prescribed burning associations has been really inspiring to me in Kansas. Seeing these groups of landowners that are organizing and doing prescribed fires together in their local communities has been a really neat kind of move forward. That I follow a few of them on Facebook and help a few out. And it's been really neat to see private landowners organizing and getting trailers and working in their hyper local areas to conduct some of these that they'd be hesitant to do on their own because they might get sued by a neighbor. But when they're working with 6 other neighbors, it's pretty awesome to see some of these things growing right now.
And I'll just say that that's been a pretty key thing where I'm working at, is the rise of those prescribed burn associations, kind of helping build up that confidence among private landowners to actually implement fire.
And we use volunteers quite a bit, and we've even used that model with some of our volunteers. Once some of the master naturalists are trained up, a nonprofit we work with called Casey Wildlands purchased a burn trailer through a Missouri conservation grant. And now we have an entire trailer full of burn gear for certified master naturalists to assist on fires on both sides of the Kansas City state line. And so just having the equipment available for some of our volunteers has also helped expand some of the work we do separately when we're trying to get some fire on the ground.
I was just going to chime in and say second on that. Like I said, those PBAs have been really beneficial to get more fire on the landscape, building confidence. That's it. Until you're standing there with a lit match on a certain window today, you just don't know. And so that gives them those experiences with others around to feel confident and moving forward, having a game plan to move forward. I'd say the other thing that's a little bit challenging is we do have in some areas that people want a taste of the country. And so there's all of a sudden now there's a new home at the edge of the prairie. And honestly, that's going to play into, will that fire happen again? So now I've got one more area to protect. And so that can be a challenge to maybe minimize the frequency of it. The other thing would be local governance. And so is there a burn ban put in place? So that they might have a lot of conditions met, everything, but there's a certain either requirement or local governance that says, no, you can't burn today. And so that can be a challenge as well on a local, even within a specific county. So I think there's a lot more better communication that's happened in the last decade or so with that, and just everybody being on the same page. But those are some challenges locally.
I love those prescribed fire associations, and there has been one in southern Iowa, but I think it's become much less active. But I like what Nachusa Grassland with the Nature Conservancy in Illinois has been doing with volunteers and training them up and getting them to burn on this Nature Conservancy land, on Nature Conservancy lands. But the other thing I like is that the manager there is very transparent, and they put out a report not just to their own people but to anybody who wants to see it, and there's a list, kind of a listserv that they send these reports out about how many fires they did and how they turned out, and who, it's really a nice summary that is able to be digested by professionals but non-professionals as well. And I think getting what we do out into the public eye in a positive way is really important for us to be able to overcome some of the issues with like the I think that it would be great if there would be around key conservation areas efforts to start, and I know this takes a lot of effort, but to start a sort of an ordinance that says we allow burning. Anybody who builds in here will allow burning on, those limited burn days that we have, the burn season, that we would allow that so that they become a part of that culture of support.
I have a lot of bureaucratic issues in the Kansas City area when it comes to fire, and we were actually standing down yesterday on 2 large fires because of the need for a pollution exemption to release pollution into the air, and filling out a piece of paper on a green air quality day to allow smoke in the air. And we're not allowed to burn in the month of April in Johnson County per county regulations. And so we have multiple layers. I work across 7 fire districts, and we have to have really good relationships with all the fire marshals and all the fire chiefs. And we have ozone monitoring stations in many of our parks, and trying to get the buy-in from air quality folks that, Prairie is really important, and we can't manage them, without fire, and trying to find and build those relationships has been a key part of us successfully burning in really, really urban areas, is trying to jump through all the hoops and make sure everyone is on the same page so we can burn a 1-acre prairie in the middle of 200,000 people. It takes a lot of coordination and making sure everybody's on the same page.
And that's where that I good comments, Matt, and that's where that if we could get the kind of a grassroots appreciation for the need for fire, it would influence those people at some of those key decision-making places. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, it's great to hear a little bit about the prescribed burn associations and some of the associated efforts. That's something we'd definitely like to focus on for a future one of these, to talk about the human side of things. I've also noticed in I think within the last 10 years or so, like the training exchanges between the Great Plains and bringing in ranchers from Northern California, which is very different landscape, but similar culture and goals, and seeing the PBAs even, jump the Rockies and the Sierras to land out there. So I think that's a really cool model that is starting to take off now. And I think Lori put a link to that in the chat as well, if anyone would like to see where all the current ones are. They're really seem to be changing all the time. Let's see, so we have about 10 minutes left here before we wrap up. And I think related to some of the questions in the chat and that we were getting when people were registering, is I'd like to talk a little bit more about how you are monitoring or kind of determining whether success, how burns have been successful. We've kind of touched on that through a couple of the different comments here. Pauline had some anecdotal observations, but is also tied to lots of other monitoring efforts. And Amy mentioned the fire effects monitoring from the Park Service. But I think people have been interested to learn more about how, we have a lot of resources for planning and thinking about how to conduct fires, but how are you looking at what the fire accomplished?
There are some monitoring protocols, as I mentioned earlier, that are out there. There are some that were developed by the Fish and Wildlife Service and their partners. One is for remnant prairies and involves a walk looking at key species. There's one that I've been working on with other people in the Fish and Wildlife Service and a lot of other organizations. It's called the Prairie Reconstruction Initiative, and this is a protocol has been developed. There's a database that records what the history, as much as we know it, of, let's say, a planting site is. What did we do when we planted? What kind of seed mix did we use? What was it in the fall or the spring that was planted? And then the third piece is about management through time, because you can have a great prairie and it can go bad pretty fast without decent management or without appropriate management. And so it's sort of a crowdsourced database. And that's one way we can learn about it. If enough people put information in this database, even if you don't monitor, then at some point there'll be a critical mass of information which can trigger research to sort of sort out. We don't ask people to only put in information about a particular way of planting. We just want everybody to put in what they have so we can kind of sort it out later. But there is a monitoring element to that too, which involves two techniques. One is a meandering walk, looking at various plants and conditions. The other one is plot-based, and you can find information about that on the Prairie Reconstruction Initiative website. There's not time to really go into it much in depth here, but particularly the meandering walk tends to be very, very, very popular, because it's one of those things where you can get out there, walk around, record the species you find, and it helps, I think, in some kind of spot management decisions too, when the biologist or whoever's the field person doing the monitoring gets back with someone there may be a separate decision maker who says what's going to happen in that year. And so it helps bring that information to the surface for them. The Savanna monitoring protocol is remnants, and we're losing our savannas very rapidly now. And so it's a way to try to understand. It's similar to the Prairie Reconstruction Initiative with a meandering walk and a plot-based thing, but it takes into account not only the trees, but also the understory vegetation and conditions.
We've started a long-term monitoring program about 3 years ago with Justin Thomas, a botanist from the Ozarks in Missouri. And we've begun a long-term selection of units that will be monitoring the effects of fire. So we can look at if we're moving into Sericea lespedeza control with growing season fire, that we have some long-term data to see the stem counts on some of the activity. And we're looking to make sure that our floristic quality is staying up on a lot of these remnant prairies that we're working on. And so we've just been doing it a few years, but the goal long-term is to have a botanist on site and continue to look at the long-term effects of our fire management, and just as needed as we see changes in the landscape.
I think it's kind of interesting that a lot of these monitoring programs are justifiably plant oriented, and as a plant ecologist, I think that's great, given that how much monitoring effort goes into wildlife outside of the realm of fire. But as we've heard from Dave and Pauline, with Dave regarding the birds and Pauline regarding the invertebrates, it would be really nice if these fire effects monitoring programs that are existing would start looking at more than just the plants, and try to incorporate the invertebrates, especially since there aren't as many other efforts targeting them, and they're obviously affected by fire.
There are efforts to begin to link some of the monitoring done in some of the programs I talked about and others with the invertebrates, pollinators in particular. There's funding for pollinators, so that's what gets monitored. And so Fort Collins, the inventory and monitoring headquarters for the Fish and Wildlife Service, is looking into pushing that through and linking it to some of the other monitoring. So there's some hope that will get better.
Yeah, and my answer to kind of how to define success with fire is kind of complicated, so I'll try and keep it short. But I guess the main point that I want to make is, it really depends a lot on your objectives when it comes to wildlife, because all these different wildlife species, they have very different habitat needs, and so the decisions you might make when it comes to maybe trying to provide habitat for wild turkeys could be vastly different from if you want to provide habitat for, say, bees or invertebrates. And so kind of understanding what those trade-offs are and what the specific habitat needs are is really important when you want to want to figure out like what benchmarks are going to define success for my burning program. And so that's something that we kind of try and tell managers whenever they come to us and want to start talking about fire and how to use it for wildlife. Is a lot of times managers will come in kind of say, well, I want to burn for wildlife. You can't really burn for wildlife. You can burn for individual species. And so we really try to encourage managers to kind of sit down and say, like, okay, what are my priority species? What species would I like to see more or less of on the landscape? And that goes for both wildlife, plants, and vertebrates. Kind of come up with that list of species that are your high priority, and also take a moment to think about what species you might actually be managing against. Anytime you take a management action, there's going to be losers or winners. So understanding both who you're managing for and the ones you're managing potentially maybe against is going to be really important as you design your management programs, make decisions about how what benchmarks you want to use to define success. And, there's certain, management approaches like, patch burn grazing or heritage area management that can benefit a lot of different species. But, maybe if you're a manager who's really focused on whitetail deer, you may not want to use that specific program. And so it really just kind of depends on what your goals are and what you're hoping to promote on the landscape.
I'll kind of go along with that. And so in our planning process, kind of back to that, it's kind of really purpose driven, is what are we putting that fire on the landscape trying to achieve, kind of how we try to help monitor that, or just as meeting with that producer out in the field. And, did we accomplish those objectives as they were laid out? And so it's not a real intense necessarily, but just trying to help that producer identify or see those things that could have changed or hopefully did with the implementation of that practice. So it's kind of our evaluate and kind of step 9 of our planning process that we utilize there.
And I'd chime in a little bit that if we're managing for things or against things, it's a different game plan than if we're managing for ecological integrity. So for the more looking at it with a more holistic view. And there are times when I think managers need to focus management to reduce a particular invasive species until you get to a certain point. For example, smooth brome will sort of in our area start letting go after 3 years of annual burning when it's in early growth season. I think it's in a 1-leaf stage that you can actually kill smooth brome if you hit it right then, but that's a pretty specific target. But even if you don't hit that, after 3 years, it'll start reducing in height, it'll start reducing in seed productivity, and then annuals will start coming up through it. And that's when I would shift to, I would start, if it's something that needs to have more seed in natives put into the area, then that's the time to do it. The brome is weak, and it'll just end up being like it can end up being like almost like a cover crop that keeps some of the other weeds out. And so that's one approach. And in some areas where there is native diversity that's already there, that is remnant or native status to that area, that can jumpstart it. And then I would shift to a burn that was more like historic patterns, and maybe those dormant burns that Matt was talking about. And we are actually a part of the natural environment, although we kind of put ourselves in this role of grand manipulators, so that we we try to manage all the different pieces for all the different things, and ultimately that just you can't do that successfully. You just can't manage for all the parts of a native ecosystem. As an ecologist, I think a forest ecologist once said, native ecosystems are not only more complex than we know, they're more complex than we can know. So thinking about fire as a native process that was applied by native people puts it in an entirely different category than this tool to manipulate the landscape heavily. And then we might think about it a little differently if we understand that we are part of the natural environment and that of the native prairies and savannas. And then I think it changes the game.
All right, well, thank you so much for that. I think we'll have to leave it there on that point. And this is, for me, this last 90 minutes has really flown by. So appreciate all the different threads coming together here, and hope this is a jumping off point for more discussions like this from the future. We have representing a really broad range of folks here across the landscape, both geographically and with the expertise that you bring. And I think there's just a lot to learn from one another in terms of the practitioners and the researchers who joined us today. So thank you again for making the time to participate today and prepare for this. As we wrap up, we're just going to put a link to the evaluation questionnaire on here as well. So we'd love to have everyone fill that out on your way out of the webinar. And that's just 5 or 6 questions in Qualtrics. Lori just put that in the chat, and that will help us learn more about the usefulness of these sorts of panels for you and think about future topics. Let's see, last thing, we'll also send out a copy of that link in the follow-up email, as well as the recording of today's panel. So look for that in a couple of days once that gets uploaded and processed. With that, let's see, I'm just going to share one last slide. And these are the links to the Tallgrass, Prairie, and Oak Savanna Fire Science Consortium and the Great Plains Fire Science Exchange. And so we'll be posting links to the recordings and resources there as well. But thanks everyone, and hope you have a great rest of your Wednesday.